Hey everyone, thanks for coming by. I really appreciate you coming. I hope you're enjoying these videos. I'm enjoying making them. I'm having a good time making these things. But please take a little bit of time toward the end of the video. Make sure you go below and subscribe. Also leave any feedback and give me a thumbs up if you can, if you feel it's justified, and also leave some comments. If you have any questions or if you have any feedback or any requests for future videos, please feel free to put those in the comments below. I greatly appreciate them. So today we're going to continue along with the application that I've been creating in the last few videos. If you recall, in one of the earlier videos, I created an application using Zend Expressive. So we set up Docker containers, we set up a Docker Compose to create the containers, and then after that, we did the installation of Zend Expressive. We also set up the sample project so that way it would actually resolve. And in the previous video, we also set up a module in Zend Expressive, and we made it so that resolved to and gave us a JSON output. So what we're going to do today is we're going to install Doctrine ORM and get that up and working and get the CLI working. There is a command line tool that comes with Doctrine ORM as well as Doctrine Dbal. So we're going to get those up and working in the application, and that's our task for today. So let me go ahead and go over to the screen here, and we're going to go ahead and dig right in. So with that. One of the first things that I want to do, because again, we do have the application working, it's resolving. If I bring up my REST client, I've already launched Docker, so the Docker containers are already working. We can see those down in the that panel in PhpStorm. We can see that the containers are in fact working. And then in the REST client, if I click the execute on that, we can see that we are in fact still getting back the return that we got in the previous video, where we got everything up and working and we're getting a JSON return. So that's the point where we are. So what I want to do now is I want to install Doctrine ORM. Well, if I go over to their website, which I've already got open here, if I go over to doctrineproject.org and I go to the object relation mapper, the ORM portion, we can see that there's a command here to get everything installed, and that is composer require doctrine/ORM. Now again, we are using composer in our project, so it's easy to install dependencies using composer. It creates the autoloader and everything else. So, but the thing is we're using Zend Expressive. Zend Expressive uses the container interop. So as it's using Zend Service Manager because that's the way we installed it. We could have used Pimple. We could have used other containers. Also using container-interop, but we use Zend Service Manager. So to make this a little bit easier for us to use Doctrine ORM, there is a container-interop package out there from dasprid. He created this. It's called container-interop-doctrine. And what this does is it has a set of factories and things that make using Doctrine a lot easier if you are using an application that is using container-interop. So we're actually going to install this. And by installing container-interop-doctrine, and again, the command is very similar to what we saw in Doctrine, where we issue, and actually, I see that let me jack up my size here. So in that web page, that's a little bit too big. In the web page, we can see composer require dasprid/container-interop-doctrine. And once we install that, that also has a dependency of Doctrine ORM. If we look at for instance, if we look at the composer JSON for this project, we can see that some of the dependencies for it requires PHP 5.5 or 7. It also requires Doctrine ORM, also includes PSR container and Doctrine Dbal and Doctrine Common. So by doing the install through Composer of this package, it will also bring in Doctrine for us. So that's what we're going to do versus installing Doctrine by itself, because I want to use the entity manager. Usually when you're using Doctrine ORM, you're going to want to have entities that determine, some of the ways that you use the database, the ways that you use the domain in domain-driven design. So anyway, we're going to install Doctrine ORM by installing this package. So to do that, we'll go over to our terminal. Now keep in mind, I'm using the terminal in PhpStorm. I could just as easily open up my terminal and use the regular terminal. I use Ubuntu as my desktop operating system, or my laptop, as the case may be. So now by using the terminal here, I'm already in the directory where my application sits. So I'm going to do the command that we saw on their web page, which is saying composer require dasprid container interop doctrine. And so by doing this, now Composer is going to install the container interop doctrine, and it's going to install the dependencies of that package as well. So we'll hit enter, and now we'll wait just a moment. As that installs, it's going to go out to Packagist, find out what packages it has as dependencies, and then it's going to pull those down for us locally or in the application, so that way we have them. Now it finished, so by looking through these, we can see that it's pulling in Doctrine Lexer, Doctrine Annotations, Reflections, Event Manager, Collections, Cache, Persistence, Inflector, Common, Dbal, ORM, and of course the Container Interop Doctrine that we originally installed, right? So it brought on all these dependencies for us. We didn't have to worry about figuring those out. Composer did that for us. So that's installed. So we have the package, and we have Doctrine ORM installed. Now that we have that installed, as I said, we're going to be using the entity manager because we're going to really be heavily using the ORM in the examples that I'm going to show. So to use the entity manager with container interop, it's a little bit easier to use the factory that comes in container interop doctrine. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to install that package, is because it makes it a lot easier to use doctrine with container interop, containers, if you will, or service location, or whatever the case might be that you're using. So to do that, we want to go into our app config, because I want this to be available through my entire application. So to make it available through my entire application, I want to edit the app config, because the app config is always loaded. It's always loaded as your app is being loaded. We're going to go down here to the factories, and I want to add a factory in here. And so basically what I want to do is, I want to create an alias, if you will. We could very easily just use the entity manager, and right now the application will know where to find that. It'll know to find it in Doctrine ORM. It'll know to find the entity manager there. But what we want to happen is we want the entity manager factory from dasprid's package to be used, instead of just using the entity manager naked, if you will, because we want the container interop to be recognized by the entity manager. So we're going to start by pulling in the entity manager. PhpStorm auto finishes this for us. So this is what we want. We want to use the entity manager, the very first one, Doctrine/ORM entity manager. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter on that to let the autocomplete do it. And we do want the class. We want it to be, we want class to be used. And then what I want to alias that, so when I use entity manager, what I want to bring up is the entity manager factory. So I'm going to start typing entity manager factory. entity manager factory. And once we get to that point, we can see that, okay, this is what we actually wanted. We wanted entity manager factory from the container interop doctrine. So I'm going to go ahead and enter on that. So it auto completes it. And of course I want the class, and then I need to put a comma because this is just adding an item into our array here. So now we have, anytime that we ask for the entity manager, it's going to be aliased through to the entity manager factory in dasprid's package. Now, as I type these, one of the things that happened is PhpStorm automatically entered in these use statements at the top for us. So I could have typed the entire namespace, if you will, but in this case, I just let the namespace be populated by PhpStorm automatically, and that was done when I let the autocomplete fill those in for me. So now we've got that. Now we have our entity manager properly aliased to the factory, so that way that way we'll be able to use the container interop with Doctrine, and which is what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. Now that I've got that done, so we're able to do that. I want to also be able to use Doctrine ORM from the command line, and sometimes maybe even Doctrine Dbal. I want to use that from the command line as well. To do that, I have to create a config file for Doctrine. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go into my config folder, and in the config folder, I'm going to create a new file, new PHP file, and I'm going to call that file, which is a convention with Doctrine. I'm going to call it cli-config.php. Hit enter, and it creates that PHP file. Now I'm going to, because I already have this existing, I don't want to take everybody's time with me doing all the typing. So instead, I'm going to copy and paste it in here. So basically what I've done is I've copied in some use statements where we're using the entity manager, we're using the entity manager helper, and we're also using the helper set from Symfony Components console helper set. We're pulling in the container.php, which is the container.php is part of the configuration for Zend Expressive, and it's in the same directory that we're currently in, the config directory. So I'm pulling that in, so that way we have the configuration for the container. And basically what that looks like is it's just right here. We're using the Zend Service Manager. In this case, I could have used Pimple, I could have used others, but in this case, I use Zend Service Manager. And then I'm telling it where to find, in the container, it's telling it where to find the config, and it's also defining the service manager and launching it, and any dependencies, and it's launching the service manager. So that's how our container gets up and running. In the CLI config, it goes a step further. It says, okay, after the container's there, after we pulled in the container, now we're going to define a new helper set. We're creating a key called EM, and we're kicking off the entity manager helper. Now, when we do that from the container, because we've told the CLI config where to find the container, in the container, we want to get the entity manager. Now, you'll remember we redefined that through an alias in our config to be the factory. So that's what we're doing here, is we're calling that. So it's going to call through to the factory and use that entity manager that we just defined. Okay, so now that is my CLI config. So at this point, Doctrine would kind of run. However, it doesn't really have a database connection at the moment. I think even if we were to go, so let me go to my terminal. Now in the terminal, let me clear that. In the terminal, I need to go, in order to run that, I can't just run it from my host machine because all the files and everything are accessible through the container. So one of the things that I need to do is I want to get into my container, so that way any command line things that I'm issuing are not just local. I want to issue them from within the container. So I'm going to issue the command. We're going to call docker and exec do it, and we're looking to get into the container Expressive Web 1. And we want to start up a bash shell. Now, if you'll, let me go ahead and launch that first. So now I'm actually in the bash shell. If I do an ls, we can see the same directory from the project. And how I found this name was, if you go into the Docker tab, I can see the names of my containers here. You can go into the properties tabs of each of those and see the name there as well in the properties tab. But anyway, that's where you can find that information. So then in the CLI, I told Docker to execute the bash shell inside that container. So now I'm actually inside the container. If I wanted to issue the command, if I issue PHP vendor bin and Doctrine, then at that point I'm going to get an error because it doesn't really know where to find the energy manager. It doesn't have everything all defined there yet. We need another config. We actually need to tell Doctrine how it needs to function. And once we do that, then of course Doctrine will work. We did outline the CLI config, but we haven't told Doctrine where to find any entities. We haven't told it, how to operate basically. So we need to do that. So what I'm going to do is the next thing is to create the doctrine.local config. I'm going to do that inside my auto load directory of the config directory. Okay, let me minimize this. So I'm going into config, I'm going into auto load, and in auto load, I want to create a file called doctrine.local.php. Now I'm naming it that for a couple different reasons. One is Doctrine tells me what it's for, right? It's for Doctrine. So now I know that's going to be for Doctrine. Then I want to say local because this is my local configuration, right? This file would not be the same in a production environment. It's not really global because I might not want to use this globally. Maybe I want to have a different Doctrine configuration for other areas of my application. So I'm just going to call this local. It's not going to be global. And then of course give it the PHP extension. It creates the PHP file for this. Now, what I need to do is I'm going to copy over my configuration, doctrine.local. Let's see. So I'm going to do that, clear out some items here that I don't necessarily want right now. Okay. So I've copied over the configuration here. Basically what it's doing is it's pulling in the annotations driver. I'm pulling in the mapping driver change. These are from Doctrine. And I'm specifying just an array of configurations, right? We've got the Doctrine key. Inside the Doctrine key, we have the connections key, and then we outline the default of the connection. In this case, I'm using the same information that we used when we created the Doctrine, or the when we use the Doctrine, I'm sorry, I keep saying Doctrine. When we use the Docker compose, we set up this information. We're calling the DB host is DB. We have DB name, DB user, and DB password, just keeping it generic for the sake of these videos. Now, I'm also specifying a driver in here of how to find the entities and things like that. So this is one of the things that Doctrine ORM needs. It needs to know, where do I find any of my entities and what driver do I use to find those. Now, if saving this as is, I'm going to go ahead and close it because we're basically finished with it. But one of the things that I have not done yet is inside the folder, in the app folder, there is not an entity subdirectory. I do need to create that. Otherwise, Doctrine is going to give me errors because it's expecting to find that. So I'm going to go into my app, into the source directory, and I need to create in here a folder that maybe we'll put some entities in here, maybe not. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and just create it, just an entity directory name. And now we've got the entity directory name there according to what we put in the specification. Now, if I put entities in here, Doctrine would automatically find them based on this configuration. Alternatively, I can create other directories for entity and specify those differently. Later on, we're going to be specifying those same configurations pretty much for every module because I like having my entities by module, and as you may have picked up on the previous videos, I like having my configurations all by module. So if I remove a module, the configuration automatically goes with it, and I don't have to worry about those. All right, so now that we've done that, now that we've created our configuration, we've created our doctrine configuration, we've got all that. So let's go back over here to our command line and issue that same command, PHP, and then we're pulling up doctrine. And now we do get an answer. So doctrine is now functioning. And in here we can see some of the functions. Now that command that I just did is basically the same as if I put list on the end, right? So doctrine and issue the list command, it'll bring up the same thing. It'll bring up a list of available commands for Doctrine ORM. And we can see that there is quite a list here. First off, one of the items is list. Then we can do a Dbal import, reserve words run. We can create, we can clear the caches, various caches with Doctrine ORM. We can also set up, we can generate entities, proxies, things like that. We can do a Doctrine ORM info. This would take a look at our entities that are specified and tell us if there's anything wrong there. So let's go ahead and issue that command. So if I go into Doctrine and just issue ORM info, actually we get an error because we don't have anything there. We've specified this base, but we don't have any entities for it to catch. So it does give us an error at the moment. Now, another thing that we've gained here by setting up this configuration is not only access to the Doctrine command line, but also the access to the Doctrine Dbal command line as well. So if I put in Doctrine Dbal, and I can do the same thing. I can type in list or just leave it blank, and it's going to give me a list of the various Dbal commands in this, so that we could do things there, such as importing the Dbal and that. Now, some of those commands were already available in the ORM, but they're available here in just the Dbal command as well. So now we have a functioning Doctrine installation. We have everything up and running, and now we're ready to start creating entities. We're ready to start creating some queries and things like that. But that's for another video. That's not for this time. Today, that's as far as I'm going. I've got Doctrine up and running, and now in the next video, please come back. Remember to subscribe because we're going to come back next time, and we will. Come back next time and we will finish configuring everything, get it up and working, so that way we can start issuing some queries and run some tests on entities, things like that. So please check back. Thank you very much for coming.